I think most everybody is aware by now that on Sunday mornings we're looking at a series of lessons involving the question or the theme of what happens whenever we die. And we've really only got 2 lessons left in this series. This morning we're going to be talking about the eternity that exists in heaven. Then Lord willing, next week we'll be talking about the eternity that exists in hell. I did have another thought, and I don't know if you're interested, that's fine. If you're not, that's fine too. But I thought about doing a lesson on degrees of reward and punishment. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and we'll add it to the series after we look at heaven this morning, and Lord willing, next week, hell itself. And like I said, it don't matter to me either way. So you guys choose. Obviously, as we've looked at in the Bible teaches us that this life here upon this earth is not all that there is. We've studied about what happens whenever we die physically, and how the body goes back to the ground, how the spirit returns back to God. And immediately after we die, we're judged by God. After that, we enter into the realm, the unseen realm of Hades, where we either enter into a compartment of reward or a compartment of punishment. And there we await the return of Christ, which we studied last week. When Christ returns, we'll resurrect our bodies, change them from mortal to immortal bodies. And then we're going to find ourselves in one of 2 places for eternity. Now, when we looked at the idea of the judgment, you might remember that I pointed out, I believe the Bible teaches the concept of 2 different times of judgment. First of all, after you die personally, but also when Jesus returns, the Bible teaches us that all nations are going to stand before the throne of God and be judged, or the throne of Christ, and be judged by God Himself through Christ. And it's at that point that we're either going to be sent to eternity in heaven or to eternity in hell. And so there are only 2 eternal existence after our death, and those realities, the Bible teaches, are either in heaven or in hell. And when you think about heaven and how the Bible presents to us the idea of heaven, it's over and over and over again. You know, this idea, this place of heaven is held out in front of the Christian as a prize to be obtained. It's especially emphasized in the Bible to those who are enduring difficult times in this life. They may be going through difficult suffering, or they may be enduring trials or undergoing certain temptations, or they might be doing work for God in a very difficult circumstance. But to those people, the Bible holds out heaven and says, this is what you want, and this is what all the suffering and the trials and the temptations and the difficulties that we endure in life is all about. In fact, when Jesus was teaching His own disciples in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, He talked to them about how people would insult them, how they would make fun of them, how they would put them down, how they would lie about them. But He says this in verse 12. He says, "Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven." In the Scripture, heaven is portrayed to us as this great incentive for righteous living here upon this earth. It's our great incentive for resisting temptation while living in this life. It's a great incentive for us to endure all hardships that would come our way. And it's also an incentive for us to keep on rejoicing, to keep on being optimistic through this life that we live, to keep being cheerful in every circumstance, even in death itself. And so it's heaven. That's really what our motivation, our hope is in living this Christian life. In fact, when Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus in Ephesians 1 and verse 18, he said, "The eyes of your understanding being enlightened, that ye may know what is the hope of His calling, and what is the riches of the glory of His inheritance in the saints." Paul wanted the Christians at Ephesus to be able to see exactly what this great hope that they had was. He tells them there in verse 16, he wanted them to understand. His prayer for them was that their understanding would be enlightened, that they could see exactly the eternal riches, the glory of these riches that was waiting for them in heaven. And so what Paul is praying about the church at Ephesus there is that they will truly understand what God wants to give to the faithful. What is heaven all about? Friends, I'm convinced that as Christians, if we really understood what heaven is, if we really understood the hope that God was putting before us and the glorious riches that He's prepared for us to inherit, I think we'd stay a lot farther away from sin. I think we'd be a lot more committed in our walk with Christ and a lot less apathetic when it comes to spiritual matters. But that's what God wants us to understand. God wants us to realize that living a Christian life leads somewhere. And that somewhere is a glorious place. It's a very rich place that God has prepared for us, known as heaven. Now, the study that we're looking at this morning is more along the idea of, well, what am I going to be doing in heaven? That's really what we're talking about. What happens after death? Not necessarily the place itself, but what am I going to be doing? How am I going to be involved in this place? And so it's a little bit different of a twist maybe on a lesson about heaven than we thought of before. And so some of the normal things that you would hear in a sermon about heaven, you might not hear all of those things in great detail today. But one thing that I want to emphasize as we begin this morning is the Bible teaches us that heaven is a place of ceasing, but let me also emphasize it is not a place of inactivity. For instance, when we read it in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 13, of course, John was recording what he saw from heaven, this great vision that he was given by God from heaven. And he says, "And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Right, blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." A lot of times when we think about heaven, one of the words that is often associated with it is the idea of rest. And to me, it kind of gives us the wrong picture of actually what is taking place in heaven. Because when I think of rest, I think of inactivity, don't you? I mean, I think of just sitting down in the recliner and propping back and doing nothing. And so it's a cessation. It's a break, if you will, from something. Well, heaven is a place of ceasing of certain things. But that doesn't mean that there's going to be inactivity in heaven. You probably heard, or you might even think of the idea that some people, when they picture being in heaven, they picture sitting on this cloud and floating around playing a harp, right? Well, I don't know where that picture came from, because it's not the picture of heaven that you read about in the Bible. It's not a place of inactivity, but it is a place of rest. It is a place of ceasing, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verses 9 and 10, the Hebrew writer said this. He said, "There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God." Now he's comparing the land of Canaan, the promised land, which was a land of rest for the Israelites, to heaven for us as Christians. Well, number one, I'd point out to you, when he was talking about a place of rest in the promised land, he wasn't talking about a cessation of all activity, was he? No, but there was rest from certain things. There was rest from bondage. There was rest from continually working around the clock like they had to do in Egypt. There was a ceasing of certain things, but it wasn't a ceasing of all activity. And so the Hebrew writer says here, "There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God." Now notice verse 10. "For he that is entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from his." So here's the example that the Hebrew writer gives us of rest. He's talking about when God created, right? Well, God created the earth in this 6-day period, and then on the 7th day, what happened? He rested. He rested. What do you think God did that day? You think he didn't do anything? No. When the Bible talks about he's resting, it means there was a certain part of God's work that ended. It was over. Not that God remained inactive all that day.
Oh, there were still things that he was doing. It just, when it came to creation, he was done. It was over with. There was a cessation of that work. And friends, when we study the Bible, what the Bible teaches us is that we will rest, not completely, but rest from our labors. What kind of labors are we talking about here? We're talking about our work on earth. We're talking about when we get to heaven, we don't have to toil in earthly labor anymore. It's over. There's a ceasing of it. And so what does that mean for us? That means all of our earthly work, all of our earthly labor is done. Why do we live here upon the earth? Well, it's a battleground. It's a testing ground. And so while I live here, I have to be tested. My faith has to be tried. But when I get to heaven, that labor's over. There's a cessation of that work or that toil. When we live here upon this earth, we have to struggle with things that are physical in nature. We have to endure suffering, and we have to endure pain, and we have to put up with things that eat away at our happiness. But in heaven, I get rest from those things. My work of labor, earthly labor, is over. But let me emphasize to you, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to do any work in heaven. That doesn't mean that I'm just going to sit back and wake up. And I know we're not going to wake up in heaven, but this is how some people think about it. You're going to wake up and you're going to think, well, what are we going to do today? No, there's nothing to do. I know, let's sing a song, right? That's not what heaven's all about. Yes, it's a rest from earthly labor. Yes, it's a rest from the trials and the temptations of this life, because we passed the test. And those things are done. They're over with. But I want you to look at Revelation 22 and verse 3 with me. This gives us a glimpse into heaven, and we see what's going on there. And in verse 3 it says, "There shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and the Lamb shall be in it." Now notice this statement. "And his servants shall serve him." Now I want you to stop and think about that. Listen to what Christians are called in heaven. Servants. Now when you think of a servant, what do you think of? Well, you don't think of a person just sitting around doing nothing all day, do you? A servant is active. A servant is doing the will, the bidding of his master. His servants will serve him. Now that's about all I know what we're going to do in heaven. I don't know what all that service is going to involve. Worship is one of them that we read about. But I have an idea that there's a multitude of things that we'll be doing in the service of God. His servants are going to serve him. The difference, though, I can't even begin to describe the difference, but this is what the Bible describes to us. The difference is between earthly toiling and labor versus heavenly labor. You remember what Isaiah prophesied of in Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 31? He said, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint." I can't imagine that, can you? I can't imagine, because, when I take off running, and it's not very fast anymore, but when I take off running, I get tired eventually, right? Some people can run a long way, but eventually your muscles start to fatigue. Your breath, you get short of breath. You become weary and you become faint. That's not our service in heaven. You see, I can walk and I'm not be weary. I can run and I'm not going to fall over. I'm not going to have to stop and catch my breath. I'm not going to have to stop and say, well, my muscles are getting tired here. I can work for God without all those physical toiling and suffering and pains affecting me in any way. My labor for God, and that's part of what makes earthly toiling so burdensome and wearisome. And I'm not saying that it's burdensome to serve God, but I'm just saying being a fleshly person is. It wears on us. But in heaven, it's not going to bother me. See, I can serve God 24/7. I can serve God night and day, and I'm never going to get tired of it. I'm not going to get short of breath. I'm not going to get worn out from the things that God has given me to do. Those things, my labor, my earthly labor or toiling has ceased in heaven. I'm going to be serving God. but I'm going to be serving Him in a capacity like I've never served Him before. The service that we're going to be offering to God is going to be so easy to us, so natural to us, and so enjoyable to us. The second thing that I want to talk about today, involving this eternity in heaven, it involves the company that will be there and the company that won't be there. But have you ever thought about, what are we going to be doing in heaven? We're going to be spending a lot of time with a lot of good people, godly people. Remember when Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven in Matthew 8 and verse 11, He said, I say unto you that many shall come from the east and the west and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Can you imagine that in your mind's eye? You know, here the Bible is teaching me that I'm going to get to sit down and eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Now, I know we don't eat in heaven, and that's another subject to study, but stick in the idea that Jesus is trying to relate to us here. I get to sit down and eat a meal with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Some of the best people who ever lived upon this earth. What do you think we're going to be doing? I know what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be saying, tell me a story. You know, tell me a story about something that happened in your life. What if you had the chance to sit down and spend a meal with Adam and Eve? What would you want to talk about? You say, well, what about the weather today in heaven? It's great. No. It's going to be, what was your life all about? What happened here? Fill in the details right here. How about Moses and the 10 plagues of Egypt? You know, the Bible tells us this idea that we're going to sit down with the joyful, with the godly in heaven, and we're going to get to enjoy one another's company. Can you imagine sitting down with Christ? I mean, to us, that's almost unheard of. That's like somebody, you know, getting to sit with the President of the United States today. We can't even begin to imagine that. But we're going to sit with Christ. And you know what? We're going to communicate with one another. The Bible tells us in John chapter 21 and verse 25, John said, there are many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. What about the stories in the life of Jesus? Are there more? Oh, there's a lot more, friends. There's a lot more in the life of Abraham. There's a lot more in the life of Moses. There's a lot more in the lives of Adam and Eve. Things that we don't even know about. Things that haven't been revealed to us. Things that we've never heard about. And can you imagine sitting down with Christ and Him sharing the story of His life here upon this earth with you? Every single detail of every single day. You know what John said? If the things that should be written about Christ were written, the world itself could not even contain all the books that would be written. So much more. We got what we know to lead the life of godliness. That's all we got. But there's a lot more to those people's life. We'll meet people that we've never even heard of before, never even read about in the pages of God's Word, faithful servants of God. And can you imagine that atmosphere, what it would be like sitting down with those people? How amazing it would be, how entertaining it would be for us, how encouraging it would be to us, how stimulating it would be to share those stories with one another. That's heaven. The great company that we keep. But those things are great, but heaven itself is also great because of the company that won't be there. You remember the story of Lot, and of course probably all, or most if not all of us are familiar with the story of Lot and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. But in the New Testament, a statement is made about him. Well, it starts about with what God did to that city in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 6. And Peter wrote, in turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemn them with an overthrow, making them an ensample or example unto those that should afterward live ungodly. And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them and seeing and hearing vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. If you've ever heard me talk about this verse before, you've heard me emphasize that word vex, because it literally means in the original language torment or torture. When we think about Lot living in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, can you imagine a more disgusting place to live than that, spiritually speaking? Lot hated. He hated every minute of it. His righteous soul was tortured. He was tormented by the things that he saw and the things that he heard in that city. Can you imagine the sexual filth and perversity that Lot saw on a daily basis? Can you imagine the shameful things that these people did and the unrestrained behavior that they showed? And how did that affect Lot? It tortured him. It tore him up inside. Day in and day out, Lot had to see those things. He had to hear those things. Friends, I'm so glad in heaven we won't have that nastiness. Can you imagine that? In fact, in Revelation 21 and verse 7, John said, "There shall in no wise enter in anything that defileth it, neither whatsoever worketh abomination or maketh a lie, but they which are written in the Lamb's book of life." Heaven is going to be so great because I don't have to deal with difficult people anymore. They don't exist in heaven. I don't have to worry about my quality of living like I do here upon this earth, because nothing bad is ever going to happen in heaven. No one wicked is ever going to make it through those gates. No thieves are going to come there. No drunkards are ever going to make it into heaven. There's not going to be anybody that's allowed to enter into that place that's going to defile it in any way. All the things that get in our way here upon this earth that might cause us to stumble or to fall, all those things are gone. Can you imagine the quality of life? Can you imagine the height of goodness that we're going to experience? Can you imagine the quality of living, the meaning that we'll have in living, and the purpose that we'll have in living in an environment that is not tainted in any way by anyone or anything that is wicked or evil? It's going to be great. Not just because of who is there, but because who is not there. And friends, I'm convinced that that's why in heaven we'll be able to reach our ultimate potential for happiness. Because it's the bad people and it's the bad things that tear us down in life. But we don't have to worry about those things anymore. Heaven is a place of great company. The third thing that I want to emphasize in this study, and maybe this is a little bit different, but I think it's something that needs to be said, and you'll hear me say it, Lord willing, too, in our study of hell. But heaven is not a carnal place. And by that, we simply mean it's not physical. Now, I know that when we read about heaven in the Bible, there are a lot of times when it's described to us by physical objects and physical terms. But you still have to understand it's not physical in nature. In the book of Song of Solomon, you read about a question that's put before. If you know a little bit about the book of Song of Solomon, it's actually kind of a discourse between, well, it's believed to be Solomon and his first wife, probably, the love of his life. And they're kind of a discourse about them and between them, about them talking to other people about one another. And when you get over into chapter 5, and we're going to read beginning in verse 10, these women ask Solomon's wife, "What is it that makes your husband so special?" And so she begins describing to them what is so special about Solomon. I want you to listen to this description as we read it. She says in verse 10, "My beloved is white and ruddy, chief among 10,000. His head is like the finest gold. His locks are wavy and black as a raven. His eyes are like doves by the river of waters, washed with milk and fitly set. His cheeks are like a bed of spices, banks of scented herbs. His lips are lilies, dripping liquid myrrh. His hands are rods of gold set with beryl. His body is carved ivory inlaid with sapphire. His legs are pillars of marble set on bases of fine gold. His countenance is like Lebanon, excellent as the cedars. His mouth is most sweet. Yes, he is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem. Now, I want you to think about that description. That's kind of a weird way to describe a guy, isn't it? But do you know why she described it in this way? Because these women just couldn't understand what was so great about Solomon. And so she takes something that they know and that they understand to explain to them the unknown. Friends, that's what God is doing to us when he describes to us heaven. Okay, you can sit here, God could tell me all about this spiritual world, all about these things that are going on in it, and you know what? I wouldn't have a clue what he was talking about. I wouldn't have the slightest imagination of what's going on in the heaven. But when God tells me that heaven is like gold, I can understand that a little bit, can't I? Because it's something that I know and something that I can relate to that helps me understand the unknown. When you read about things in the Bible about heaven, that's the way that heaven is described to us. It's described to us not by things that are unknown to us, but by things that we know. So that through things that we know and we understand and we can see, we can have a concept, a picture of what heaven is going to be like. And let me illustrate it to you in this way. Well, let me just say this. A lot of the passages that we read about heaven are found in what book? You know? Revelation, right? And what do we always say when we study the book of Revelation? We say just what John tells us in Revelation 1 and verse 1. It's a symbolic book. It's not to be taken literally. So John uses, we've been studying this in the back with our classes, John uses symbols and numbers to represent something else. John uses earthly things to represent heavenly things. He uses physical things to represent spiritual things. And so when we read it, we read about things about heaven as if it's earthly in nature, as if it's physical. Let me illustrate to you. Turn over to Revelation chapter 21 with me. In Revelation 21, I'm going to start with the easy one because I think we can all see from this verse what we're talking about here. In verse 15, John records, "And he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city, and the gates thereof, and the wall thereof. And the city lieth foursquare, and the length is as large as the breadth. And he measured the city with the reed, 12,000 furlongs. The length and the breadth and the height of it are equal." Okay, so what is heaven going to be like? Here's your physical measurement, okay? Take out the yardstick, right? Start writing it down. Start measuring it off. These are the dimensions of heaven. And so he says it's 12,000 furlongs. Its length and its width are the same, and its height. So it's a city in the Bible that is described as foursquare. Now, you take that and you put it into modern terms, physical terms, and you compute it, and what you're going to find is heaven is a city that's about 1,500 miles across in length, and 1,500 miles in width, and 1,500 miles in height. Now, let me ask you, should we take that literally? Should we be packing our tape measures whenever we go to heaven, pulling it out and say, yep, that's just like it was supposed to be? What are we supposed to get from this? It's not a literal measurement that we're supposed to understand, but it's saying to us, heaven is enormous. Heaven is big. In fact, I was looking up some of the cities, and the largest city in square miles, as we would think of today, the largest city that we have is New York City. And Encyclopedia said it was 7,234 square miles. That's big, isn't it? 7,234 square miles. You know how big heaven is? 2,250,000 square miles. You see the difference? That's just the surface area, because the Bible goes on to say its height is as big as its length and its width. It's 1,500 miles high. That's big, isn't it? That's big. Now, I know in New York City you have some buildings that reach pretty tall, but you don't have a building that reaches 1,500 miles high in the city of New York, or in New York City. So when we read that, we think, wow, that's big, right? The Bible is telling us heaven is an enormous place. It's not a measurement to be taken literally, but it's big. When you read in Revelation 21, look at verse 18. It says, the building of the wall of it was of jasper, and the city was of pure gold. One of the interesting things in verse 17, if you look at it, it says the thickness of the wall was 266 feet thick. Can you imagine a wall around a city that's 266 feet thick? Was that to be taken literally? No. You know what it's telling me? Protection. You see, there's great protection in heaven. Nothing's ever going to make it through that wall. Nothing's ever going to get to us. Nothing's ever going to take us away out. No enemy is ever going to breach that city. It's symbolism that's given to me in numbers and in words. Things that I can understand to help me understand the unknown. He talks about the building of that wall was jasper. Jasper is a crystal-like rock, green in nature. It reflects a lot of light. So that's what when you think of jasper, you're thinking of a very colorful place. You're thinking of something that sparkles, that catches a lot of light. He says the city was pure gold, like unto clear glass. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about, well, the streets of heaven are going to be gold. Well, the Bible said the whole city. Not just the streets, the whole city. And it's so pure that when you look at it, you can see your reflection in it. That's how pure it is, like clear glass. It's like looking in a mirror. Now again, I want you to stop. God's going to build that city with physical gold? No. You know why? Because it would tear up, wouldn't it? It would fade away. He's describing to me the unknown by what I know. Talks about the foundations of the wall that are garnished, made up of all precious stones. It's going to be very beautiful. In verse 21, there are 12 gates in this city, and every gate was of one pearl. Can you imagine that? In other words, he's saying every gate is made out of pearl, and it's not just like pieces of pearl. It was made from one giant pearl. I don't know how big gates in a city would be, but in heaven, if you've got a building that we read about with, over 2 million square miles in it, and if you figure the height too, which was 1,500 miles high, it's almost 4 billion miles, I guess, cubed is what it would be. How do you get a pearl that's 1,500 miles high? You ever seen a pearl that big in our world? No, it's not a literal pearl, friends. But it's describing to us something of magnificent beauty, something of great worth. And he goes on to talk about, in verse 21, every several gate was of one pearl. The street of the city was pure gold. It was as transparent glass. In verse 21, or chapter 22 and verse 1, he says, and he showed me a pure water, a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. Can you imagine that? Somebody says, is there going to be water in heaven? I don't know why you need it. We're not going to take a bath and we're not going to drink anything. So I don't know what purpose it's going to serve for us. But this magnificent river, this pure river, you could look, it could be 50 feet deep and you could look and see the bottom. And it's so smooth at the top of it's like glass. It reflects everything. I can understand that, can't you? But I'll guarantee you, if God tried to tell me about heaven in spiritual terms, I wouldn't have a clue what he's talking about. You see, everything that you read about in the Bible when it comes to heaven, whether it's numbers, whether it's description, it's the number of perfection. Do you know why the city is square? Because it's perfect. A square is perfect. Every side is the same. That's heaven. Do you know why it's described as gold? Because it's something that I can appreciate and something that I know has tremendous value. Pure water is something that is just amazing to the human eye. The reflection of the beauty of nature off that water. Those are all things that I can understand. And I think a lot of times when you talk to people about this idea or this aspect of heaven not being physical or carnal in nature, somehow, because we're so physically minded, we think, man, if it's not made of pure gold, it's going to be bad. I can't appreciate it. If it's not really a pure water that reflects everything in heaven, I'll have no appreciation or value for it. If the gates aren't literally made of pearl, it's not going to be what I expect it to be. And you know what the answer to that is? It's not. It's not going to be anything like we expect it to be. It is going to be so much greater. In fact, Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 9, he said, "It is written, the eye hath not seen, nor the ear have heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for them that love him." I had never seen anything like heaven before. There's nothing on earth that compares to it. I've never even heard. There's some great things that you hear about on earth. I've never even heard about anything greater than heaven in this life. In fact, Paul even talked about my heart or my mind. I can't begin in my wildest dreams to dream about heaven or imagine it. Even if it was just something off the top of my head that really doesn't exist in reality that I can make up that would be something great to me, it does not compare with the glory of heaven. You see, human words can't adequately describe it. Physical objects can't adequately represent heaven. The human mind cannot adequately comprehend the gloriousness of heaven and the beauty of heaven and the riches that God has created for us. And so how do you help me understand it? You explain to me what I know so that I can better understand the unknown, but you still can't explain it to me. You might have heard of the story of the preacher who preached a sermon about heaven. And after he finished with that sermon, he thought he did such a great job. He says, turns to the congregation, he says, "Now, how many of you want to go to heaven?" And everybody raises their hand except one little old lady in the back. Well, after services are over and people are going through the line, he talks to the older lady and he says, "Listen, I noticed, I asked the question, how many people want to go to heaven, and you didn't raise your hand." He said, "Well, why didn't you raise your hand? Don't you want to go to heaven?" And she said, "Well, just how soon are we talking about here?" I think that's how we often think of heaven, isn't it? We want to go there, but not right now. Because we don't know for sure what heaven is like. We've never experienced it ourselves. And the unknown can be scary to us. But friends, my lesson for you, or my point that I want to make as we're winding down here is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Because it's going to be so much better than you can ever imagine. It's going to be so great. We can't even begin to fathom the glorious riches that God has prepared for us in the eternity of heaven. But the scriptures do give us a glimpse into this place. And if I had this great invitation all prepared. I even had Dennis pick out a certain song for it, but we're not going to get there, so we can just forget about that. But if there was a place like that existed on earth, would you want to go there? If there was a place where you would never get sick, there was no disease, you could never hurt, whatever you do, you could never get hurt, you would never die, would you want to go to that place? What if I told you there's no crime there? Nobody ever stole anything, no thief is allowed. No drunkards ever enter into that place. Nobody who lies. Everybody who lives there is totally honest. Would you want to go there? The second question is, what would you give up to go there? What would you be willing to give up? Somebody says you got to give up your house to get there. Would you do it? Somebody says, well, turn in your car, trade me for your car. and you can live in that place, would you do it? What if you had to take every penny out of your bank account and give to somebody? Would you do it? You don't have to eat anymore. Every one of us, if this place existed on earth, every one of us would give up everything we had to go there. That's heaven. Are you a Christian this morning? If you're not, why won't you obey the gospel? If you've already obeyed the gospel, but you haven't been faithfully and you need to